think you've done pretty well. There's an odd one in between because they're planted about far apart. It's real sand on top, but it's only so far, and it's hard gravel like this stuff underneath. It's not deep sand. But deep sand too, of course, dries out, and whereas that stuff holds a bit of moisture where they are getting in like hard gravel. Years ago, there was no trees around here. They were all just salt flats. Turn right, just this side of those trees coming up.
Which way did you get the last lot of rain?
It's 30 mil out here.
Seems to be pretty consistent, about 30 mil everywhere.
Yeah.
Or 32 in normal.
Yes. These trials were put in by Calm back then. The idea of just seeing what species grow best where and that kind of thing, and how they go with cutting. And there was about 9 species. It was all replicated and everything, but it's pretty obvious that some species grow well and some, just don't produce as much. There's huge difference. So, and some of the good ones that performed everywhere, pretty well from Geraldton to Esperance, are the ones that get planted a lot nowadays. Like there's Planissima or Borealis. They're really, common. Millions of them get planted every year. And the York gums, that smooth bark York gum over there, you can just see that, they're going pretty well. But the reason they were put here is because I had a suspicion there's an underground stream, because the salt was coming out of the creek, and we put that drain down between the trees and the water supply, and that was runs a lot of water, that little drain. So obviously there has been water coming through. But now whether the trees have stopped the water or the drain, I'm not too sure, but a bit of both. I think it's a bit of anything and everything to do with land care, and you'll get on top of it if you can get the source of the problem.
I've got some salt bush and thought I'll give it a go because at least I'll get some grazing out of it. And we ended up with a really good success in a really dry year, although when you're planting on saline ground you have got moisture coming up rather than relying on rainfall. So we planted this area out to the right, and because most of this country was not cropping productive sort of country, and it's got a band of oil mallees on the outside edge. Most of these areas are only bare because they've not grown anything, that's an obvious statement. But they haven't grown anything because they've become saline, but they don't even catch any seeds because they're bare and they blow, and you've got this chicken and egg thing happening where nothing's ever going to happen in this middle section because there's nothing to catch seed. So even just chucking a bit of hay on here, and that's the obvious place to put a bit of hay is on the bare country, just made a little difference through this 100-yard section here. And there's a few things you got to think about when you're planting. One is the species. There's 2 species here. There's Rivermore and Old Man Saltbush. There's a lot more work being done now with the different provenances of saltbush, because any one of you like chewing saltbush, some of these you'll chew and you'll spit out because they're instantly yuck, and others you'll chew and you say, well, I'm not a sheep, I don't really like it, but it is chewable. So you'll find the sheep will do that when they're in here grazing, they'll just leave some because they're bloody yuck,
I've just never seen it quite as distinctive as this, where this kind of buffer of mallees helps distinguish sort of land use.
Well, the other thing about this, in theory, they're using, there is measurements done on how much water used, but if I was guessing, I'd say these are using a lot more water than they are. On the edge of the crop, there must be water going down and coming sideways this way, and these are kind of like the sponge, the tea towel thrown down to stop the water running under the fridge. You know, that's what these are. I mean, probably the root mass with these, the root mass is the same on top as it is underneath.
They planted at the same time.
Yeah, same year. Yeah.
But usefully, these can generate, if you can leave them there forever, and happy to do so, these can generate a carbon revenue where these can't.
No.
So you can actually earn a bit of money and fulfil a useful function, as well as help pay for that land care.
Well, see, the thing about
That's expensive.
this is land care and this is expensive, but it's also land that you come out here, and my grandfather was told conditional purpose, clear it and you'll have the land. So we did that, but the problem is we've now got it cleared, but we haven't got the land for a land use. So some people would say this has got a zero value because I can't earn an income off it. Yes, I'll chuck 15 old ewes down here, but now it hasn't got a zero value, and it'll never have the earning capacity that out there was, but it's gone from being that sort of country. So you look at it, I look at it from a different point of view, and so now I can earn money off it. Now it looks better. So the alternative was more of what you're seeing sort of down the middle there.
He said, no, my tank is nearly empty, 'cause the light is flashing red. There's no time slowing down till I drive you out of my head, out of my head.
The oil mallee and the whole idea of getting oil mallees into an environment which is sustainable from the aspect of planting trees into the agricultural region, still being viable as farmers. Being viable as farmers is one of those things I think everyone's beginning to worry about, whether you have trees or not. But anyway, my father was the inaugural president and one of the founders of the oil mallee industry, and he got very keen on growing trees. So Dad started planting trees in alleys, mostly along contours, which turned out to be probably not all that smart, and we went away from that and ended up planting them in straight rows. Nature often gets things right, I think, and planting them in straight rows in the end fitted in with auto steer, and so they've become much less a hindrance to our operation than perhaps you might think by planting trees into large paddocks. So we started planting a lot of trees, and as because of Dad's starting the thing, I sort of inherited, and I went on to become the president of the Central Oil Mallee region. Our role was to progress the idea of planting mallees into viable country, rather than just round little salty areas or long fence lines, which made the farm look nicer, but really didn't achieve what we're trying to do of lowering water tables and arresting salinity and stopping wind erosion. And we can have lots of arguments about how many trees you have to plant to achieve all those things, but my argument is that some trees are better than none. But we thought, well, how are we going to encourage people to at least have a go at planting trees? And the idea of oil so the idea of planting them as a crop became reasonably interesting, because, okay, if they can pay their way, even if they just pay the opportunity cost, then perhaps that'd be a reason for people to start planting them. How are we going to do that? We sat around the table as a committee on several long meetings and decided that the way to do that was to actually show that we could get oil out of the leaves, and it could have the potential of being a viable industry. Because in some ways the potential for having those trees as a crop backfired on the industry a little bit. But people were beginning to say, well, until I can see I'm going to make money out of oil, I'm not planting trees. So I sort of lost sight of the original intention of planting those trees, which was to control salinity and the other things I spoke about. And so we formed a little company called Kalani Distillers, which was pretty much involved all the people sitting around the table in that little committee. We then made the decision that we should have a central location and work out a very efficient way of carting the biomass once harvested to the facility. That still limits you to somewhere around 50 to 80 kilometres. I think that's, once beyond that, biomass starts to become uncommercial because of the transport cost. And that's what you see here. We applied for a grant, got the solid fuel boiler, and it uses around about 20% of the biomass that we process is required to provide the energy to get the oil out. So it makes beautiful fuel, and it also makes really nice mulch for gardens. It does, no matter how efficient the distillation process is. You always get a tiny percentage of oil left in this. This facility and the whole Kalani Distillers thing is on a bit of a knife edge at the moment. The 6 people involved in Kalani Distillers have pretty much certainly run out of money. We've been putting a lot of money, our own time and money into this project. We haven't had anything back much apart from a little bit of oil we've sold. Well, but I'm probably underrating that a little bit. We have sold quite a bit of oil. I think we were amongst one of the top producers of oil in the country for a little while. What it needs now is someone with a bit of money to come in and invest a little bit of money in it. I think then it could become quite a nice little industry in the town, that as long as it has the biomass to support it. 5%, but a bit like looking at a grain of wheat. But anyway, so every one of those little white pustules is a tiny little...
Like that one there's got little ones.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's right. So every one of those little white pockets is oil. If you crush it up in your fingers like that, you'll get that's. If you do that at home with your mallees at home, you'll find it's a lot stronger than that. That's not very oily. The ones that when you do it at home, you'll find your fingers are really oily from that, whereas these trees haven't been selected for their oil. I'll just give you a little brief history on the development of the harvester. We began to realise that a flail type harvester, which is what is mostly used for mallee harvesting, doesn't suit our soil types and doesn't suit our environment. If you have any sort of wind effect that has any sort of loose sand in your tree rows, a flail harvester tends to pick that up. And any sand in your biomass when you try and distill it robs you a lot of oil. So we decided a saw blade was the way we should go. Did a bit of research and found that the German forestry department were developing an industry around growing poplars and using that for renewable energy. They engaged an engineer to build a harvester which was called the Timberwolf, and I contacted him, and as a result of that, myself and one other Kalani Distiller member went to Germany, and from Germany down to Bavaria with this engineer, and with a lot of hand waving and nodding and shaking and drawing and in the sand, we commissioned him to build us a harvester very similar to the one we saw over there harvesting the poplars. And I was the most surprised person when it actually turned up on the wharf in Fremantle. We've been modifying it ever since, but it's probably one of the most efficient and successful harvesters of that sort. Well, it is the only one I think I know of in Australia that's actually uses a saw blade and chips the biomass in one go and puts it into a bin. This also has its birth in the ore mallee. I started to wonder about the biomass. We talked about it as having a value, and as a mulch or as a product like that, unless you've got a high population base, it's just too far to carry it. So we started looking at other ideas, and I was sitting on the board of the ore mallee company at the time, and the chairman of that company is a guy called Sid Shea. And Sid had started to develop probably a passion, I think you would call it, about biochar and the potential for biochar to improve the environment. Anyone want me to explain pyrolysis?
Yes, please.
Pyrolysis. So it hasn't allowed the oxygen to get in to join with the carbon to make CO2, so the carbon's left behind as charcoal. So he and I collaborated a little, and we built some very, very basic biochar pits on the farm, and we put mallee in and we played around with temperatures and that sort of thing. And there's some pretty funny stories about that too, which ended up in my farm being nearly burnt down and Sid losing all the hairs on his arms and 2 Japanese customers going home with no eyebrows. And anyway, I had WorkSafe here yesterday, so I'm not allowed to talk like that now. We've got a big tick. So biochar became an interest to me, and I went to a conference I think it was the inaugural IBI conference run in Terrigal, north of Sydney, and met a Melbourne businessman over there who'd been involved in the aluminium industry all his life, and he was looking for ways of that might generate energy that was from a renewable source. He saw biochar as a byproduct of that. We all got together and formed a little company called Rainbow Bee Eater. We quickly realised that there was not going to be enough biomass from trees alone to form any sort of a business, or even really begin to start spending any money investigating that. So we looked around for another sort of biomass, and I still can't believe I didn't think of this because I'm surrounded by the stuff, but the son of the Melbourne businessman said, well, why don't you use straw? Because he saw pictures of these mallees growing in alleys through the straw, and he said, why don't you use straw? There's lots of that, and it's right there. So that changed our focus a little bit. I'd still want to have mallee involved in this, and I think if the mallee population increases, then I think it makes a better biochar, more, and its energy density in the gas is slightly better. But straw's right here. So out of that machine comes biochar and clean gas, which looks like the gas in your gas stove. At the moment we're flaring it. Eventually it'll be going into an engine, running an engine and powering a genset, which will put energy into the grid. We're away from achieving that yet. I got involved in this 5 years ago, and in October last year we finally got our hands on this pyrolyser the first commercial one that had ever been built, and it still is, and brought it over here, and we've been commissioning it in the shed since October. In January we did our first run, reasonably successfully, discovered a whole heap of problems with it, and over the last 3 days we've been running, and you can see the dates on that biochar that we've been making almost 500 kilos of biochar a day, which would make us the biggest biochar producers in Australia by a long way. And we've developed a good relationship with Western Power. I've got to say it was bloody awkward, very difficult at first. They have I don't want to know. Yep. You know, it's just, and I don't blame them, it's too hard. The whole thing, our whole industry, power industry is developed on find a big lump of energy, coal, stick a power station there, and then build the lines out and get skinnier and skinnier and skinnier as they go. And that's how the world works with electricity. Now these guys, people like us, are coming along saying, oh, why don't we put a little power station here, and we'll have hundreds of them, we want to feed it back the other way. That's going to be generational, I reckon, with Western Power. The little pyrolyser you see in there will produce enough energy to run Kalani. That's that little one there. So it's not a very big footprint, and you could fit that in your lounge room nearly. So 4 or 5 of those in a modest shed would run a medium-sized town. The biochar is 80% carbon, and that carbon, it's not going anywhere. You can throw it on the ground and it'll still be there in 1,000 years. It's way more permanent than a tree. Science will argue about whether it's 100 years, 500 years, 10,000 years, but who cares? 100 years, we've done our bit, haven't we? Let someone else worry about the next 100. There's some evidence to show that biochar in an animal's gut increases its ability to convert nutrients, and certainly it decreases the amount of methane and nitrous oxides that the animal emits. Yeah, if every cow in New Zealand needed to eat a kilo of that a day to make it carbon neutral, well, you just couldn't produce enough. So there's lots of possibilities. At the same time we're doing that, we're producing, for a tonne of straw, we're producing roughly a megawatt. That's a pretty rough number. Everything's got to be going really smoothly to do that, but roughly a megawatt, of which we can export about 0.75. That offsets around about a tonne of coal. That doesn't have to be dug out of the ground. And we've stored that carbon in the soil from our biochar. And at the same time, just by the way, which is what we're really doing, it's probably going to... Have you noticed how it's already cool around Kalani? I have. The last few days, it's good. When you head down there, it's going to get hot. I'll tell you what, Harry will be turning the air conditioner up on the bus when you drive away from here. So it's already working.
This Ian's farm, Ian's son's farm, just a little part of it, and in 2009 Elementary planted these trees. It was more just a trial planting, so they're Ian's trees, so they're 4 years old. And then here's a waterway that was planted up another 10 years older. Another way of integrating the trees into the farm. So there's sort of two examples here. They could sell carbon from those trees if they wanted to.
That's a tree every metre and 1.4 metres, I think, something like that. We started going to 4 rows because the Kyoto Protocol indicated that you needed 10 metre coverage and it wouldn't comply if it was only 2 rows. So that's why these are all 4 now. Well, you have mallees. Those ones were planted in 99. I think the mallees were planted about 2 years after that, so they're about 10 years old. You can see, if you look down in, you can see what the tree used to look like. See, this is the second time this tree's been harvested in that time. So there would have been 4 years of coppice.
Gee, you cut them really low. I didn't realise that. That's unreal, isn't it?
My experience with trees here is the ideal to harvest them the first time is 5 years, and they sometimes get a bit big, but it does give the tree a really good chance to really establish itself and make it resilient, because harvest is a shock. You know, the tree's not going to like it very much. When we come back to harvest these again, just fly along there, and it's very productive.